It's good to be here. Thank you for receiving me so warmly. I have a text, and I'm going to stick to it and make my arguments, and then we can open it up for discussion. So it's a pleasure to be here. My alma mater, MIT. I have fond memories of my years here as a graduate student in economics a half century ago. I'm going to defend a controversial thesis in my remarks today, to wit, freedom of speech in American society needs to be protected from the excesses of a universally embraced ethic of anti-racism. I'm going to argue that, ironically, the failure to do so could seriously undermine the worthy goal of achieving a just society. There are things that don't or can't get said when we talk about race in most venues in America. Those of you who have followed the 16-year-long conversation on this topic that I've been undertaking with Columbia University Professor John McWhorter at my podcast, The Glenn Show, know what I'm talking about. Whether it's crime or out-of-wedlock birth rates or academic underperformance or the unbearable intellectual lightness of much anti-racism agitation, in academia, in the mainstream publications and media outlets, and increasingly in K through 12 classrooms, what I have called the bias narrative holds sway. Negative aspects of Black life are attributed almost entirely to the nation's history of racial oppression, which is said to begin in the early 17th century and to continue unabated to this day. We are said to be a bandit society built on genocidal plundering undertaken by unrepentant racists. That's one story you could tell. And if that story were just one of many circulating through our national discourse, it wouldn't be the worst thing. But this bias narrative has become not just one of many stories, it's now the only story. In newspaper opinion pages, in scholarly journals, and in educational materials disseminated throughout our schools. It's the story told by the White House. It's the story that ramifies out from the most elite precincts of our country and shapes ordinary conversations and relations between individuals. Its grip on so many areas of the public imagination has become so tight, particularly at academic institutions like this one, that anyone challenging it is viewed with suspicion and often enough outright contempt. Should any alternative explanation for Black underperformance be proffered? It's not the explanation that gets challenged, but the individual making it. For to challenge this bias narrative, ipso facto proves that one is a racist or a deplorable, or if the challenger is a Black man, like me, a self-hating Uncle Tom. To object to this narrative is to invite ad hominem attack. I believe this situation to be intellectually infantile and morally bankrupt. But even worse, I think it is also socially counterproductive and politically ineffective. We need to stay in touch with reality. How we talk and think about race has consequences that can be measured not just in dollars and cents, but also in stagnant lives and dead bodies. Responding with ad hominem attacks to any account of our current predicament that is not rooted in bias isn't merely unfortunate, it's actively damaging. The stakes are high and the hour is late. Candor, integrity, and courage are in short supply in our national conversations about race. Name-calling and character assassination have replaced open debate, while naked emperors, pseudo-academics, and bombastic demagogues command the public square. Enter John and Glenn. Or, as I like to refer to our dynamic duo, the woke busters. Our singular focus, our primary job is to call them like we see them. And despite the fact that I tread here on thin ice, that's precisely what I intend to do. A professor, or politician or entertainer or some other public figure accused of racism before charges can even be investigated, and poof, their career goes up in smoke, whether or not they've actually done anything genuinely worthy of censure. Often they're guilty of little more than choosing their words carelessly, or just as often they're guilty, at least in my view, of nothing more offensive than telling the truth. This state of affairs is untenable, and I have no problem saying so. Indeed, calling someone a racist these days is a bit like calling them a witch. It's to accuse them of having evil beliefs because they've deviated from the woke party line. Such beliefs, though, are not necessarily evil. Attending to inconvenient facts, like a racial disparity in out-of-wedlock birth rates, or in academic achievement, or in participation in violent criminal offending, is not ipso facto an act of racial hatred. And I cannot be the only one who thinks so. Others feel the same way, and more of them are beginning to speak out against specious accusations. But not yet enough. Many who recognize the terrible injustice of such accusations fear repercussions from defending the accused. They don't want the mob to direct its ire at them. They have much to lose and little to gain. As we game theorists have long understood, a boycott's success depends critically on the effectiveness of its secondary sanctions, that is, punishing those who do not punish those who deviate. So if the anti-racism witch hunt is to work, everybody must shun the purported racists. In fact, many who do so are merely pretending that something truly evil is afoot because they don't want to be shunned themselves. They're going along to get along, suppressing skepticism. Such widespread suppression is a disaster waiting to happen, in my view. It creates conditions ripe for exploitation by canny demagogues who can harness the resentments of the stifled masses and, in the process, unleash something very ugly on this country. That is my greatest fear. That is why it is important for me to speak out. So brace yourselves. I once read a book by the German political scientist Elisabeth Neumann called The Spiral of Silence. Her argument was that there can be some views or some thoughts about some issues in society that get defined in such a way that it is inappropriate to hold those views. As a result, people who do, in fact, hold those views but who do not want to be shamed and ostracized don't express them. And because they don't hear it said by others, anyone holding the view thinks they may be one of the very few who do so, and not wanting to be out there alone, saying something controversial, they keep their thoughts to themselves. A spiral of silence ensues. I'm going to call this a naked emperor equilibrium, an ongoing situation in which the emperor has no clothes and everybody can see that he's naked, and yet everybody thinks, I sure don't want to be the only one to say so. And as a result, we collaborate in a charade by keeping our real views to ourselves. Then somebody comes along who defies the consensus and speaks out, like the little kid in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Clothes, who doesn't realize he's not supposed to say out loud what everybody can plainly see. The thing about that kid who says, the emperor is naked, is not simply that he says it, or even that others hear him saying it. Declaring the truth out loud in the public square is a truly subversive act precisely because it creates a situation in which everybody knows that everybody else has heard what has been said. What began as widespread private knowledge of an unspeakable fact is suddenly transformed into a shared public consensus, making it safe for anyone else to assert that fact. But spirals of silence can be unstable equilibria, susceptible to being undermined by a cumulative snowballing process of revelation. The real-life agent of change The kid in that story could turn out to be a Trump-like figure, only more effective, smarter, shrewder. Somebody who can see that when a millionaire takes a knee at a football game and says, "I refuse to stand for the national anthem," there are a vast number of unhappy people who fear to say so. Someone who understands that a Black Lives Matter activist standing on a vehicle with his fist balled up shouting, "Burn this city down," deeply upsets a lot of people. Someone who believes that to abandon meritocratic standards at our most elite venues of intellectual activity in the interest of achieving racial diversity is to step onto a slippery slope that slides all the way down to mediocrity. A clever and ambitious politician, a shrewd manager of public images, could create circumstances where more and more people feel safe expressing such views. And the more who express them, the safer those who have yet to speak will feel in expressing them too. If a widespread view has been kept under wraps by the boycott threats of the anti-racists, then an explosion can occur. You could find yourself in a very different country tomorrow than you see today as the spiral of silence unravels, as a daring naysayer takes on the slings and arrows of being called racist while tapping into widely held sentiments. My fear is that regarding the most controversial racial issues of our day, violent crime in Chicago, in Philadelphia, racial preferences everywhere, not just in higher education, slavery reparations, believe it or not, a real policy in the minds of many, compulsory diversity training, resented but unspoken of by so many. This is the situation we now confront. It's a situation that can unravel in a very ugly way. This is not my wish, it's my prediction. I want now to give two concrete illustrations of what I'm talking about here. First, I believe that it is absolutely imperative to de-racialize our political discourse in this country on crime, violence, and policing. There are dangers to seeing police killings primarily through a racial lens, and it is totally unnecessary to do so. After all, more whites than blacks are killed by police each year. These events are regrettable regardless of the race of the people who are involved. To emphasize that an officer is white and a victim is black, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, for instance, is tacitly to presume that the officer acted as he did because the victim is black. And yet, we don't know that. Even in the most egregious cases like that one in Minneapolis that set off a summer of protests and riots across this country. Once we as a nation get into the habit of viewing these events through a racial lens, we may not be able to contain that way of seeing and talking to instances of white police officers brutalizing black citizens. We may soon enough wake up and find ourselves in a country that talks about black criminals who kill white victims. That is a world no thoughtful person should welcome, because there are a great many such instances. Thus, on November 21st, 2021, 39-year-old Darrell Brooks, a black man, drove his SUV into the annual Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin, killing 6 people and injuring 62, among whom were members of a group called the Dancing Grannies. His victims were all white. I ask you, was that a racial incident? I dare to ask you, could I be the only one asking? Brooks, whose trial concluded in a guilty on all counts verdict, was surely a violent criminal who needed to be dealt with appropriately. But he didn't stand in for his race when he acted so viciously, and neither did Derek Chauvin. Brooks's white victims must not come to see themselves primarily in racial terms. That's a disaster for our country. Yet our hyper-racialized rhetoric around crime, punishment, and policing invites them quietly to do so. We should not welcome a society where events of this kind are interpreted reflexively in racial terms. Those doing so when the assailant is black and the victim white cannot be relied upon to remain silent forever. The lawyers, activists, and demagogues, ambulance-chasing demagogues, who gratuitously bring a racialized sensibility to every adverse police-citizen encounter, are playing with fire. I maintain that, and I fear that their race card playing will not be the end of the game. Here's another example. Consider the racial justice advocates in the academy and the media who are obsessed, droning on about the evils of whiteness. I strongly suspect that they are playing but one side of the whiteness card. I wonder if a white guilt, white apologia, white privilege view of the world cannot exist except also to call forth a white pride backlash, even though the latter is rarely expressed openly, it being politically incorrect to do so. Confronted by a person who constantly bludgeons me about the evils of colonialism, who urges me to tear down the statues of dead white men, who insists that I apologize for what my forebears did to people of color in centuries past, who demands that I settle my historical indebtedness to them via reparations and so forth, I well might ask myself, were I one of these white oppressors, on precisely what ground does human civilization in the 21st century rest? I might enumerate the great works of Western philosophy, science, and mathematics that culminated in the Age of Enlightenment, that allowed modern medicine to exist, that gave rise to our understanding of the origins of the species and the origins of the universe. I might cite great artistic achievements of European culture, the architectural innovations, the paintings, the symphonies, and so on. And then, were I in a particularly agitated mood, I might ask these people of color who think that they can simply bully me into a state of guilt-ridden self-loathing, where is their civilization? Now, please don't misunderstand me. What I just said, I believe, is correctly described as racist and white supremacist rhetoric. I wish to stipulate this. I would never actually say such a thing myself, nor am I trying to justify this viewpoint. I'm merely observing that if I were one of these so-called white people, it might tempt me. And I can't help but think it's tempting a great many. We can wag our fingers at them all we want. We can call them witches until the cows come home, but my point is that they are a part of the racism mongers package. If one is going to go down the road of denouncing whiteness at every turn, then one must expect that kind of backlash. For how can whiteness become a site of unrelenting moral indictment without it also risking to become, for many, a site of pride, identity, and ultimately of self-affirmation? Promoting anti-whiteness and the Black Lives Matter movement often flirts with precisely that, may well cause us to reap what we sow in a backlash of pro-whiteness. The spiral of silence on race-related issues may not be a stable equilibrium. So in the interest of achieving a truly just society, the anti-racism crusaders who punish every deviation from their party's line with ostracism, cancellation, and public shaming ought to stand down and chill out. This is an unspeakable truth which, like that innocent child exposing the emperor's nakedness, it is my solemn duty to apprise you of. In closing, Here's my counter narrative to the bias narrative, just to let you know where I'm coming from. I am a Black American intellectual in an age of persistent racial inequality in my country. I am an Ivy League college professor and a descendant of slaves. I am a beneficiary of the Civil Rights Revolution, which has made possible for me a life that my forebears could only have dreamed of. I am a patriot who loves his country. I am a man of the West. I am an inheritor of its great traditions. Tolstoy, mine. Franklin, mine. Hamilton, mine. Adams, mine. Newton, Maxwell, Einstein, mine. So what, I ask, are my responsibilities at a forum such as this? I feel compelled to represent the interests of my people, but that reference is ambiguous, invoking as it does both communal and civic antecedents. At this moment of so-called racial reckoning in the United States, I want to declare for all the world to hear that regardless of the political turmoil enveloping us, my fundamental responsibility, and yours, is to stay in touch with reality and to insist that others do as well. According to my counter-narrative, the currently fashionable elite opinion concerning Blacks' relationship to the American project serves the interests of neither the country nor of we Black Americans. The America ain't so great and never was posture is sophomoric indulgence for we Black Americans in the 21st century. Our birthright citizenship in this history's greatest republic is an inheritance of immense value. Black Americans are a privileged and blessed people. Our Americanness is much more important than our Blackness. My narrative. The Civil War left 600,000 dead in a country of 30 million. The consequences of that war, together with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enacted just afterward, was to make the enslaved Africans and their descendants into citizens. In the fullness of time, we have become equal citizens of this great republic. Should that have taken another 100 years? No. Neither should my ancestors have been enslaved in the first place, but slavery has been a commonplace human experience since antiquity. Emancipation, the freeing of slaves en masse after a movement for abolition, that was a new idea. It was a Western idea, the fruit of enlightenment. It was an idea brought to fruition over a century and a half ago in our own United States of America with the liberation of 4 million people, an achievement which would have been impossible without moral commitments and philosophical insight cultivated in the 17th and 18th centuries in the West. Ideas about the essential dignity of human persons and about what makes a government's exercise of power over its people legitimate. Something new emerged at the end of the 18th century in the North American continent, and the subsequent extirpation of American slavery led to something that advanced the morality and the dignity of humankind. It is a fact that abolition and the incorporation of African-descended people into the body politic of the United States of America were monumental, unprecedented achievements for human freedom. So, I say here and now, without equivocation, that the American nation belongs to me, a descendant of slaves, every bit as much as it belongs to anyone else. And here is my final unspeakable truth. The question confronting us Black Americans today is not whether we are included within the body politic as full heirs to the bequests of American political culture. Most obviously and emphatically we are. Rather, the real question for us descendants of slaves today is not how to end our oppression, but rather it is what shall we do with our freedom? What shall we make of this enormous inheritance, which is our birthright citizenship in history's greatest republic? I just hope I don't have to get canceled for saying so. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your observations. And I want to apologize for my clumsy introduction based on inadequate research. I'm going to take the dodge of the age and blame it on ChatGPT. Now, if you're willing, we have a very interested audience to probably pose some questions to you, and I'll hand the mic around, and you'll get the honor. First.
Oh, okay. I'm going to get in trouble. I just had to disagree with something you said, and I can't not say it. You said our Americanness is more important than our Blackness. This is untrue. Our Blackness is our Americanness, and our Americanness is our Blackness. We made this country. We are Americans, where there are no more American people than the black people of the United States. We defined freedom. The struggles of our people in this country defined freedom, not just for Americans, but for the world. When those people in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, they sang, "We shall overcome." They hearkened to us. Black people, we play a historical role. Black Americans, we are a new people. I'm married to an African woman. I have African children. I'm not African, I'm American. We made this country because it is the black people of the United States of America who taught the world what it means to be free. Simple as that. Without black people, you do not have the America as we know it. You don't. You just don't. We are Americans. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, I'm going to take that as a friendly amendment because I don't find anything to take issue with there, and I appreciate the passion of your profession of Americanness. No problem. It's all good.
Professor Loury, Steve Carhart, class of 70. Is there some way that we could begin to talk about our cultural heritage apart from our racial heritage? Because I think this is where it is going, and talk about white culture or black culture, if we could see our culture independently of what our genetics would be, is there any way we can begin that conversation? It seems to me that's where your thoughts are going.
Well, yeah, that's certainly compatible with my thinking. You didn't say the word class, but you might have said that as well as a different dimension along which to compartmentalize and analyze the kinds of disparities that we're concerned about. The evocation of race, of course, carries with it a presumption of, in the context of the history of American anti-black racism, as they say. And as I suggested, it brings to mind a causal analysis, which is the disparity in question has happened because of some race-based enmity, discrimination, exclusion, denial of opportunity, mistreatment. And I think that may have been true at mid-20th century. It's certainly considerably less true today. Moreover, I think that race is a pretty flexible concept. It's not as if we're talking about a location on the human genome where we can differentiate amongst individuals. We're talking about constructed social conventionality about how people are classified in our interactions with them. In our country, it's got to be very dynamic because the country is very dynamic. We basically, we're a country of immigrants. The mid-60s civil rights revolutions also saw a revolution in the liberalization of immigration laws, and scores of millions of people have come to the country in the last half century from ports of call that are not Europe and are making their lives here. Race is dynamic, interracial marriage, and so on. And so there's every reason to try to be moving away from thinking about these things in terms of race. You mentioned culture specifically, and yes, I mean, if I want to know why some families are sending their kids to the exam schools in New York City or Boston at so high a rate, I might want to inquire into what's going on in the homes, what the parents emphasize, how much time is spent on homework, what is regarded as a dignified way of living, how do people spend their time. These are cultural things. So if I want to get to the root of inequality, I mean, and I was talking about educational achievement, but I could have also been talking on the other end of the spectrum about criminal behavior and acting out and so on. I mean, who's raising kids? I mean, where's the supervision? What models are being set for how to comport oneself in the world? These are cultural things. These are real things. Try to get a sociologist to talk about those things. Try to get a sociologist to say that the family structure matters in terms of the resources available for the raising of kids if you wanted to try to calibrate what was going to be the outcome from the child rearing process, the structure of the family, the nature of relations between the adult men and women that gave rise to the progeny are absolutely fundamental. Try to get a sociologist to take that seriously. I mean, some do, but very, very few do. There's a downplaying of cultural influences and a emphasis on economic and, in the case at hand, racial issues, which I think is excessive. So, I mean, that's how I'd respond. But you asked me how to, and I don't know how to. How do we change the conversation to be this instead of that? I can say I think the conversation should be this rather than that, but it's a little bit above my pay grade to figure out how to undo this consensus that somebody used the term the left. I understand that. The woke, I've used that term. You know, there's a consensus sensibility that's going to be hard to disrupt. I'm not in a chair.
Hi, Professor Loury. Thank you so much. Caleb Pocha, Harvard College. And I have two quick questions. One is, how do you think it would be possible to challenge this pernicious racial essentialism as a non-black student? I've, in conversations, discussed issues related to these and been disregarded as coming from a place of privilege. It's not my position to speak about it or talk about it. And my second question is, do you believe it is possible to achieve a post-racial society like someone like Camille Foster or Coleman Hughes might advocate for or hope for?
You know, we economists are sometimes called the dismal science. And the reason is because we're the bearers of the bad news that there's no free lunch. You know, people want to do something, they want to solve a problem or whatever, and we're there to say, well, there are no real solutions, there are only trade-offs. You have to balance against competing ends because resources are limited, I'm sorry. And I'm here to tell you there's no such thing as free speech either. Not literally free. There's unfettered and unrestricted expression, but if you speak in a particular way and others hear you speak that way, they're going to have a reaction to you, which you're just going to have to deal with if you want to speak. You can't expect to be exempted from the consequences of people hearing you speak and then reacting to you in a certain way, which is my way of saying it, and it's very easy for me to say because I'm 75 years old and I'm a long way from a college frat house. You have to have the courage of your convictions. You got to front people. You got to tell them, you're not going to bully me here. This is a view. If you've got an argument, I'm open to it, but I'm not going to be shamed out of taking a reasonable position until you disabuse me of it by providing evidence and argument to the contrary. You got to be the kid that says the emperor has no clothes, and you got to roll with the punches. Sorry. As far as post-racial America is concerned, I mean, I have a dream, and not to make fun of the great Martin Luther King Jr.'s great speech, 1963, August, Washington Mall, Lincoln Memorial, he had a dream. I have a dream My dream is that 100 years from now, you'll be talking about race, blackness, and so forth, in the same tones that one talks about being Irish or Italian today. 100 years ago, being Irish or Italian was a very thick identity. Came with all kinds of things, both internal in terms of my people and external in terms of those people. And it ain't like that no more. I mean, there is St. Patrick's Day, et cetera, but it is a different dimension altogether. I don't see why we can't be hopeful about evolving in that direction, but we're a long way from it.
Next question.
Yeah, I'm very taken by the example you used. The Waukesha, Wisconsin, the black guy killed a group of white people, and also George Floyd, vice versa. So in other words, there's underlying similarities, disregard our skin color. If I may, I want to share with you one example I myself experienced. Years ago, there was a cow disease, right? The mad cow disease in the US. So, the beef, everything has to be, re-examined and everything. That time in East Asian countries, everybody cheered up, because they said, oh, Americans, they eat, divine cows. Now they got punished by God, right? So they cheered up. And then many Americans, and including Europeans, they think, East Asians, you guys eat dogs, you're barbaric, uncivilized, so you need to be punished. And the East Asians call them, you eat beef, you're barbaric, you're uncivilized, right? So cultures are different, skin colors are different. However, the underlying similarities is very striking. In the case of George Floyd and the Wisconsin case, on the surface, very different, the same thing, but there's underlying similarities. So my question to you is, why are we so trapped by the surface differences, such as skin color, physical attributes, right? How can we overcome from that, in order to see the underlying similarities, to testify, actually we're more similar than different? What would be your undertaking to overcome this epistemological trap?
That's a good set of questions. So I don't know is my honest answer, but I'll say a couple of things. Let me first ask whether you can agree that this is not so much a political as it is a spiritual issue. It's about how we understand ourselves in relation to other human beings, and I'm not trying to proselytize by offering any particular religious take. I'm just saying, transcending this impulse, resisting what feels warm and comfortable and soothing and natural, and standing above it. When we're called to do something like that, spiritual resources can be important. So that's not really an answer. It's certainly not a program of action, but it's a suggestion that I don't think the political structures are up to the task. We were talking about Wisconsin. So in Kenosha, somebody named Jacob Blake was shot by a police officer and the city burned down. It was a big deal. I don't want to parse the details of the case, but let me just say that Blake appeared to be stealing his girlfriend's car and kidnapping her children. He had a knife in his hand. He refused police directives. He was tased and was unresponsive to the tasing, and he turned, wielding the knife when he was shot. Was in the process of turning with the knife in his hand. This is all documented fact about the case. Became a cause célèbre. He didn't die. He was, crippled by the bullets in the back, gravely wounded, but in the hospital recovering. I recall that there was a presidential election going on in 2020. I recall that the Democratic candidates for president and vice president phoned the hospital room of Jacob Blake, spoke to him. Now, they could have done that, fine. They could have done that, and then gave a press conference about having done it. As we used to say back in my neighborhood, what's up with that? In other words, the political interests, I give one example, were not to de-racialize. They were to hyper-racialize. They were to make worthy of presidential attention a miscreant. I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but when you steal your girlfriend's car, kidnap her children, and attack a police officer, that's what you are. Because he was black. And because there were people on the margins of either voting or not voting who might have been moved to vote and pull the lever in the correct direction if his blackness had been emphasized. So, I hope that we are able as a people, American people, to rise above the sectarian pettiness and to see ourselves in our full humanity and to outgrow some bad habits. But I'm not counting on politicians to lead us there.
I just want to add the Blake incidents, and Kenosha formed the Racial Equity Commission, and I was elected on that commission.
How about that?
So you use the example of the emperor's new clothes. And in that story, the people know the truth, but they're too afraid to speak it. Is it possible in these cases where people sort of over-blame racism for problems, that people actually believe that, or is it that they're more like the emperor's new clothes? They know they're incorrect, but they say so anyways.
I'm really glad that you asked that question because I started out calling attention to my long conversation with John McWhorter, and this is one of the things that we disagree about. He says he doesn't think people are as cynical as I think they are. See, I think everybody knows that 70% of kids being born to a woman without a husband is a sociological disaster, that a community characterized in that way is fundamentally crippled, and that nothing is going to get better until something is done about that. I think people know that, and yet the sociologists that I was giving reference to, and yet they elect not to say so in the interest of maintaining the fiction. John thinks, don't be so sure that they know it. They actually think that they're doing right and they're doing good and they're on the right side of history and their thinking is muddled and their acquaintance with the evidence is casual, but they really believe what they're doing. And I say, no, they don't. I think the demagogic ambulance chasers whom I called out a moment ago, the ones who show up in front of the microphones anytime something happens and wave the bloody shirt of racism, know exactly what they're doing. I think Al Sharpton knows exactly what he's doing. I think Benjamin Crump knows exactly what he's doing. They're playing with fire and they know they're playing with fire. John, my friend, thinks, oh no, they think they're crusaders, they have a cause, they really believe in the cause. I think there's nobody who's confused about the fact that if you have carjacking 15-year-olds running around in DC or Baltimore or Cleveland or Chicago or St. Louis or New Orleans or Philadelphia, jacking people's cars, that eventually it'll kill the city. People who can move will move. Businesses will not expand. The tax base will go bad. You're spinning in a spiral down the drain. I think people know that. So my answer to you is that some of this stuff, mass incarceration is structural racism, I don't think anybody really, really, really believes it. And I mean, I just might be giving them too much intellectual credit because it seems pretty obvious to me that you don't get the racial disproportion in incarceration that we have in this country without a huge behavioral disparity in the law-breaking behavior of the people who are members of these respective populations. Now, that doesn't have to be the end of the discussion. We can talk about what the causes and remedies and so forth of that are. But the fact that this is some kind of racist conspiracy visited upon black people, it's absurd on its face to me. I don't see how anybody could believe it. Not really. So, thank you.
What's been your experience at Brown University holding the views that you do?
Okay, well, you know, I've been there since 2005. That's 18 years. So it's been a while. My views have not always been exactly as I am stating them here. I have moved to the right. I'm just going to tell you, by the force of events and whatnot, over the period of, I don't know, Trayvon Martin, which was 2012, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Brown, which was 2015, if I'm not mistaken. Stuff has happened that has moved me. But I'm notorious and controversial. My colleagues outside of the economics department pretty much shun me. There are massive enterprises at Brown devoted to the subject that I've been talking about here today, and I've yet to be invited to address or participate in any of them, and I'm okay with that. Center for the Study of Slavery and Social Justice, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Inequality and whatnot. I could be on another planet. I might as well be an alien. But my classes are oversubscribed. We have to turn them away at the door. The kids are coming not because they agree with me, but because they want a breath of fresh air. They are tired of being indoctrinated. They want to hear these issues, controversial issues, genuinely engaged, I think, I speculate. So I'm teaching race, crime, and justice to 100 undergraduates. They write papers. I give lectures. They take issue. They passionately express themselves in class. They feel free. I make sure they know that they're free to disagree with me as well as with each other. And I'm okay. So it's something of a mixed bag is what I'm saying. In the economics department, I'm respected. I mean, I am, I'm in my 70s. I'm not exactly at the cutting edge of the research dynamic of the department, but I have a distinguished academic record, and people are happy to see me among their company as a member of the department. But outside the department, I'm that guy. What's that about Brown Alumni?
You were on the cover of it.
Oh yeah, so the editors of the Brown Alumni magazine saw fit to send the able correspondent around to interview me, and then made a cover story out of it. And I was the same guy for the interview that you've seen before you here today. So kudos to them. Now I will say that some aging alumni have been writing in to the Brown Alumni magazine for years saying, how come you haven't done a piece on Professor Loury? How come you haven't done a piece on Professor Loury? So the editor might have felt, kind of like he had to do it. I'm not saying he did or he didn't. He might have also been enthusiastic about doing it, but they did it.
So two quick comments and a serious question. I'm very happy to hear your comment about the students at Brown being very interested in what you have to say as opposed to the faculty. That's comment number one. Comment number two, your comment about does the guy that's on MSNBC, the black guy, who's having a senior moment, Al Sharpton. I can tell you from personal experience dealing with Al Sharpton that he knows exactly what he's doing, up close and personal. Question, so we have, particularly in the South, an attempt to balance the racial makeup of the Congress by gerrymandering districts on a basis of race. Maybe that made sense at some time in the past. Maybe it makes sense today. I'm curious about your view on that, or should we assume that black folk like President Obama can get elected by white folk? Do we need racial gerrymandering in this day and age?
Yeah, these cases are in the air. I think it's Alabama, isn't it, where there's a redistricting battle going on. And people are saying that the Voting Rights Act requires that if you can draw a minority district, you should draw it in the interest of giving African Americans a maximal chance to elect representatives of their own choosing. So this is, I have to preface with my answer by saying this is sacred ground for many people. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we're talking about here. Whenever a debate about this question, whether it's what the Supreme Court wants to do or what a politician wants to do or a state legislature wants to do, they're going to invoke the Voting Rights Act of black people. They're going to say you're trying to limit people's voting rights. I'm going to tell you, you asked my opinion, I'm going to tell you my opinion. I think this is as profoundly wrong-headed a theory of representation in a democracy as you could possibly have, to equate a person being represented by the fact that the sitting member has the same race as they do. Is that what we mean by representation? We're representing races? Why is it that a white Democrat can't be every bit as effective, if you are a Democratic voter, in putting forward a set of policies, most of which have nothing to do with race, as a black? How is it that your representation is, in virtue of that fact alone, manifestly enhanced when the constituents' racial identity and the racial identity of the representative coincide with each other? That's just me. That's just my kind of theory. I was very influenced by the work of the late Abigail Thernstrom, a political scientist whose book, Whose Votes Count, I remember the book from like 1987, 1989, something like that, took up this issue with a careful parsing of the cases and of the legislation, and argued for an interpretation of the Voting Rights Act that would wean us away from this kind of racial representation view. I was also impressed by a book by a political scientist named Carol Swain called Black Faces, Black Interests, in which she made the following observation. Take a state like Georgia, it's got however many congressional districts it's got, I don't know how, 13, 16, whatever. And you mass the blacks into the maximum number of districts that you can mass them into to get them to be 50 or 60% of the electorate, which means you take them away from all the other districts. The other districts become more white, more conservative, as Georgia after all, more Republican. So you end up with a congressional delegation that's got more black people in it and more Republicans at the same time. Have you advanced the interest of the black representatives, residents of that state, or have you not done so? It's very unclear whether you have or you haven't. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on the jurisprudence of this kind of thing, but my understanding is the Supreme Court has acted in cases which have limited the interpretation of various sections of the Voting Rights Act, like the preclearance provision, which requires a local jurisdiction to go to a federal court to get an okay before they can do things like change the location of polling places or other kind of ballot-related procedural matters, on the assumption that in the past, such discretion had been misused in order to deprive black people of the right to vote, even though that's a historical relic which is no longer relevant to the contemporary circumstance of those states. And the Supreme Court has said no. And people like my friend Randall Kennedy, the law professor at Harvard, African American, and a relatively sensible guy of liberal persuasion, he says, no, the court is wrong about its interpretation of the voting rights cases, and Congress has, in effect, said that the same historical conditions that elicited the Voting Rights Act in 1965 are, to a greater or lesser degree, continue to be present in those areas, and so we need to stay vigilant. But my view is that it's all resting on a theory of representation that is also mid-20th century, and that is not suited anymore, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, to our contemporary situation. But, as I say, politically, it's sacred ground. People are going to invoke voting rights. They're going to invoke African American equality in the ballot box, and if you're not a conservative Republican and you have to run in a constituency where that kind of thing has traction, you may not want to be on the wrong side of the progressives on that. It's my view.
Okay, we're at the time, so why don't you join me in thanking Professor Loury for both his insight and his candor.
Thank you. Thank you.